to all you guys out there that have been asking, you want to see and hear about the Chateau's history and learn some information about how we got to where we are and what we're doing right now at Chateau de Lalacelle. And I think looking into the past, it makes it relevant in what we're doing now and why we're doing it the way we're doing it, and how we've done it the way we've done it, because some of the history relates to what we've actually done and created in that as well. And it is really, really interesting. We don't have the archives that likes of Stephanie and Patrick and Stuart have. We are really envious of that, because to find any information about Lalacelle, it is really, really difficult. And a couple of years ago, we had Lucy Bianfe contact us, and she'd managed to trawl through some archives and find the information because she knew where to look. And I think in the next few months, we're going to have to do the same. We're going to have to visit the archives in Alençon, and now we have names and details and dates. We can be a bit more specific with our searches and try and find out the information of the people that lived here and its past and its history, because it does have a really rich and fascinating history, from catastrophes to completely crazy people at the chateau, to people being sent to insane asylums, to being sentenced to death. It's so much has gone on over here in the years. And it's not until you sit down and actually look around and realize like how much of an impact not only it had on the chateau but the local area as well. Because Chateau de Lalacelle, it used to cover a massive area. It used to have over 100 hectares of land, which would have encompassed everything that we can see here. It likely encompassed the town as well. So an event here or a catastrophe here impacted everyone around it. So we'll delve through, because we've got history dating back to the early 1800s, which is about as far as we've been able to get back to right now. The 1700s, it's so vague and so much information missing. It is really difficult to try and track down the information from there. But from the early 1800s, even since then, so much has happened here. So let's dive into it. So the first owner that we know about was René Charles Philippe de Saint Nicolas, and it's a long name, and he lived in the chateau in the early 1800s, and he was a renowned royalist. And obviously it wasn't a great time to be a royalist or be living in a chateau either, because at that time there was a massive rise up and insurrections against the royals, and we know Napoleon came to the throne and made himself emperor of France. And our René that lived here he was an insurrectionist. He was a naughty man, because he still supported the royals. And that's where it links to what we're doing now. We know that the people that lived here in the 1800s were massive friends of the Bourbon family, which was the Louis. And when you look around at what we've actually created, although we've created suites that are in theme and reference to Olympic and Titanic, the Olympic and Titanic actually took them themes from the Louis XV and Louis XVI era as well, along with a number of other different themes that they used throughout the ships. And that makes it relevant to what we're doing as well. And we know that René Charles Philippe de Saint Nicolas would love what we're doing. It was in keeping with what he would have had here. But at the same time, at that time, the whole chateau changed. The whole history of the chateau changed. Where I am now, I'm sat in the billiard room, and this would have been the entrance into the chateau. This way you would have came into the chateau. And at the time, there would have been no tower on the front. There would have been no stairs up the front. So we can only assume that at some point there was a set of stairs in here, a grand staircase that would have took you up onto the next floor, because there's literally nowhere else in the building that could have gone. So he's changed all that. So he's had a big impact on how it was and how this looked, and actually creating the chateau itself and actually becoming a chateau. And without him, it would have been so different, just with even the configuration and the layout of everything that we've done here. From the gardens, we know back in the day that the gardens going all the way down to the farm were actually beautifully kept. We don't know whether there were flower gardens like what we're doing in a formal setting. We don't know whether it was vegetable gardens, which is quite likely. But we know that there's a farm just down from us. So it could have been that the farmers maintained up here in the gardens, the vegetable gardens and everything, but he's changed it all around at that point, and everything's kind of changed. He's took this from the front to the back, and it's kind of in his time, just after his time actually. So we've done previous videos on René Charles Philippe de Saint Nicolas and talked about his links to the Bourbon family and why we're doing what we're doing. So he stayed here. He was at the chateau. He died in 1871. He didn't die at the chateau, but he died at a royal old age of 82, which was really good at the time. He there's a little bit more about him. We went back and forwards. He went to jail. He escaped. Well, he got released from jail, and then he got sentenced to death again. So he fled to Jersey, and we don't have much more about him after that. We just know that he fled to Jersey, and he died in 1871. So, moving on, after René Charles Philippe de Saint Nicolas, we come to Mr. Verdier David. Now, for us, it's a really pertinent thing because we bought the chateau from the Verdier family, and we don't know if there's a link to Mr. Verdier David, to the actual Verdiers that we bought the chateau from. But Mr. Verdier David, in his time at the chateau, changed so many things, and so many things happened while he was here. He seems like quite a character as well, with his little family that he had here. He didn't actually initially move into the chateau. He used to have people run it, and he lived in Alençon. And it wasn't until about 10 years after he bought the chateau that they've obviously got it up to spec for him, I'm guessing, because he didn't live here, he didn't want to be here, he had other jobs. And one of his jobs, which I find incredible, because previously I was a councillor, Mr. Verdier David was a municipal councillor as well, and a high-ranking judge. So it's quite weird and quite strange that just the links and links to us, and links to him, and links to who we bought the chateau from. He wasn't only a councillor, a judge, and anything else. He actually changed the whole cider process making in France. Now, next door to us, lots of you will know, we have a beautiful cider factory, and it makes cider from all the apples in this area. Normandy is famous for cider, but Mr. Verdier David actually changed the whole process of how that's done for the whole region from Château de Lalacelle. And we actually have the newspaper article where he talks about how he changed it and why he changed it as well. What happened was, it was tradition that cider was made in the cellars, and in this article it talks about how the vaulted ceilings in the cellars and the cool temperature didn't really work for the brewing. So Mr. Verdier David wanted to think outside the box. So in, I think it was 1893, he looked at a different way of creating cider and doing things differently. And he took the cider from the cellar, and he created where our wood store is, he created another like cider barn. And what that did was it increased the temperature, because our cellar stays at 8 degrees year round, it doesn't change. And he realized that that was too cool. He wasn't making enough cider quickly enough, and he could only get, I think it was 3 fermentations a year. And he brought it out the cellar, and it changed to 4 fermentations a year. So he realized the difference it made. And because of that, he wrote an article to the Alençon Times, as it was, or the Alençon Press, and told everyone that try this and it works. And now that's actually what they do in France. It's a different way of doing it. And they carried that on for about 50, 60 years after, just purely on his observation. So he was a really clever man. So with Mr. Verdier David, not only was he a councillor, a judge, a cider maker, he was a yarn launderer and trader. And it's just crazy to think that the life that he had and how much he actually did in the local area. He was very well known and very well respected as well. And we actually know that one of the previous owners, and we believe it to be Mr. Verdier David, was actually at one point the Mairie of Lalacelle, which again just ties it all together, and it just brings some pertinence to the chateau and what we're actually doing. We know the names of the families that lived here as well, all through the history and everything that we can find. The people that lived at the chateau, the people that worked at the chateau and actually looked after the chateau, was so well looked after. This wasn't somewhere that was where people were mistreated or anything like that. And there's some beautiful, beautiful stories. And that leads us on to the actual next owner of the chateau, because when Mr. Verdier David died in 1908, his daughter had married a Mr. Louis Picheroux. And they took on the chateau after that, and they lived here for, I think it was around about 30 years after. But in that time, we know of families that lived here, the families that looked after and maintained the chateau. But they were so kind with the families. We know of people that were maids that were pregnant, and they brought them into the chateau and actually had their babies and looked after them in the chateau, allowed them to live in the chateau and bring their children up in the chateau, which is on the 3rd floor, which is where we live now. So it's got a really peaceful and nice history to it. And even some of the tenancy agreements that we've looked at shows that they've provided for the people that live on the lands. Now, France at the time was known for, it was sparse, it was difficult, and people had a hard time. And it's nice to know that the people here were looked after. It's nice to know that there's no dark history here. So As with Mr. Pichiau, he was actually born in Le Ferty-Massy, which is just up the road from us. And again, it's not long since we found all this information out, but everyone was from this sort of area. We haven't found a massive amount about him, but we know definitely 100% he lived between 1911 and 1931. And the farm, we had farm workers here, and it was the Chuisse family. Now, we've actually had them visit at one point as well, saying that their family was part, and they still live in the area, and they still like to come back to Lalacelle and see the chateau and talk about I think it was their great grandfather worked here. He was the gardener at the time. So the timeline of the owners that we have is René Charles de Saint Nicolas. He owned the chateau from the early 1800s, which makes kind of sense from when the tower went on. And he sold, or he was no longer part of the chateau up until 1852. And that's where Mr. Verdier David comes into the story. After that, it stayed in the Verdier David family as such up until 1936 when Mr. Pino took it over. So it's gone from Mr. Verdier David to Mr. Picheroux, who was the son-in-law of Mr. Verdier David, to Mr. Poisson, which we don't know anything about, from 1931 to 1936. And then Mr. Pino bought the chateau in 1936, and he had it up until the late 1950s. And that's where a lot of the changes have happened within the chateau, and a lot of the work's been done. Because what it looks like to us, there's not been a hell of a lot of maintenance done on the chateau or upkeep of the chateau in the 1800s to the nearly the mid 1900s, and Mr. Polino's kind of had to come in and mop up the mess and change the configuration of the chateau and really downsize as well, because of the fact that this was such a massive piece of land that was owned, and so many farms and so many things. But there was a bit of catastrophe while Mr. Polino was here, and we think that's played a part in the actual selling off of the land and having to sell off the assets because of what happened, and I'll come into that in just a little bit more. So Mr. Polino, he was born in 1989, so he'll have been about 45, 50 when he actually bought the chateau in 1936, and he moved in here with his wife and his son. Now his son had difficulties, he had medical difficulties, so they had to have a full-time nurse living. And again, that's why we think that the configurations kind of had to change. It would have had to change because they didn't have the access and the disability rights that they had at the time, so there would have been no like lifts to help them up the stairs. So they moved a nurse in to help him, which could have been in a room down here. He could have had a bedroom down here. We know that he had like severe difficulties. We just don't know the entirety of what them difficulties were. And it's where Mr. Polino, we've always talked about the kitchen being in the cave, and we know it was Mr. Polino that brought the kitchen up out of the cave into the actual room that we're going to be using for our little petty kitchen as well. And it just made things easy. It made life easier on the servants because it just meant that they had to pop next door. They weren't having to pop up and down all the time. And it meant that they were able to prepare food quickly and easily for people. And that's when we think that the tunnel's been covered up though, and the stairway down into the cellar, because that kind of makes sense. And we don't know 100%, and I can't wait to get into digging that little bit and just finding out, because I think we're gonna find some absolutely amazing things when we do that. I think we're gonna find tunnels. I think we're gonna find what was here, because we know for a fact there was a tunnel here somewhere from the dining room. We just have to find it, and we think Mr. Polino's had some hand in covering that up or hiding it. But while Mr. Pino was here, we know that he did have quite a team of workers. He even had chauffeurs and stuff living on site. He had cooks, he had gardeners, he had maids, and obviously he had the nurse to look after his son as well. But we actually found the article that talks about the fire that destroyed not only some of the farms around here, it destroyed 100 hectares of Mr. Polino's land. Now we can see that there was fires in buildings. Obviously we found the building on the back. We don't know when that burnt down. There's indication that it could have been in Mr. Verdier David's time, but there's also a massive indication that it could have been in Mr. Polino's time, and we don't know which one it is when that building's actually been lost from near where the cider factory was. And that would have been a kind of cider processing place, because it makes sense, and it's exactly where the cider factory is now. But in 1937, a massive fire destroyed it was the forest of Multon, which doesn't exist anymore because the fire wiped it out. But we're assuming it's these backlands here because that's all forest now as well. It's just not called that anymore because it's all been reconfigured and changed since it's all burned down. And that's where Mr. Polino's had to basically sell the land off. So they don't know if it was an intentional act. They don't know whether it was a complete accident. They're not sure whether it was a deliberate fire to actually force Mr. Polino's hand because he owns such a massive area that we live in right now. So we don't know, and this is where we need to do some digging on the lands because it'll probably indicate some clues at some time. So as soon as we're done with all these restorations, we can get into the digging and actually start looking at what Mr. Polino did here. So we know that Mr. Polino completely changed everything here at the chateau in terms of how we see it now. And we know that because we've got some of the older postcards from just before he bought the chateau, so from the early 1900s. This place didn't look like it did. It was quite drab. It was quite miserable. We know that the shutters were all brown, the railings were all brown, and it was just, it didn't look as nice as it could. And it's at that time Mr. Polino's obviously come along and he's freshened it all up, he's changed it all, he's changed everything to bright white and literally started to give the chateau back some life again, because it appears even in the early 1900s that it was going into a bit of decline back then. A lot of works had to be done by Mr. Polino, and if Mr. Polino hadn't came in, it's a good chance that this chateau wouldn't be standing as we see it now. But Mr. Polino, out of all the ones in the history from the early 1800s, he's been the one with the money. He was a rich man. He had other buildings. So he had another chateau. He had an apartment in Paris. He had I think it's an apartment in Monaco as well. So he was really quite a rich man, but he did spend the majority of his life here. And the reason for his other places that he lived, it was because of his tradings and the business that he did. And we've even had a letter at one point to Mr. Polino addressed, I think it was from the Ayatollah of Iran. So yeah, there's little links, and it's him that's kind of changed everything. And the reason for the P on the weather vane as well, lots of you have always asked. We believe it's from Mr. Polino because that makes sense, and it was him that did a lot of the work to transform the actual exterior of the chateau and see it as we do it. And that's the route that we're following, and that's why we're doing everything white now. You can blame Mr. Polino for that one. But in around 1946, we know that Mr. Polino was struggling a bit. Now, he only went on to live for another 8 years after 1946. So he died about 1954. And it's at that time we've got the numbers of the people that were living here. So instead of having like 8-10 servants and lots of people working here, he went down to 2 servants, 2 farm workers, a chauffeur and a nurse, and that was it. So from the massive amount of staff that they've had, it literally had to come down. So that's where the land must have started being sold off, because there's no way that this amount of people could manage this amount of land. So that's where it started to change the actual what Lalacelle was. And at the time, it was the L'Huissier family that was still living in the outbuilding, and they were the ones that lived basically in Tracy's cottage. And we actually met them, guys. We actually met somebody that was from that family that grew up there until she was 8 years old. And she was explaining the story of how what is now Tracy's living room, that was their bedroom, it was their bathroom, it was their living room, and where we've put the stairs, that was their little kitchen, and the rest of it was just all for the animals. She told us how she used to sleep with the chickens because it used to keep them warm and it saved having to put heating on or burn logs. So it was nice to see it, and to think of, like, it's only 60 years ago, 70 years ago that there was people that were living here but still having to live like that, because at the time France was still very poor and it just didn't have the money. So moving on, we come to the Bulon family now. The Bulon family actually took over this after Mr. Polino, and this is where the story gets really sad. And the Bulon family bought the chateau but didn't have any money. They'd bought the chateau, they didn't know how to restore it, they didn't know how to look after it, and it's the sad decline that starts from the mid-1950s when Paul Polino died, right the way through really till the mid-80s. It's gone downhill and downhill and downhill. Now, we believe that it was the Bulon family that lost a lot of the land around here because they couldn't afford to pay their taxes, and what the government did was took the land off them bit by bit to actually cover the taxes that they weren't paying. We know that at some point in the time that the forest out the back of us here was used to replace the beams that are in the chateau now as well. And it only makes sense that it was in the 1950s, 60s sort of era. So what, 60, 70 years ago, that all of this has had to have been replaced, because again, I think it would genuinely have fell down if it was in the state that we think it was in back then. But that's all she's done. That's all that Madame Bulon did. And she didn't have children or anything living here with her. She didn't have her husband living here with her. It was just her and herself. And it didn't do well from there. She kind of became a recluse. She didn't look after any of the lands. She didn't look after the property, the outbuildings, or anything like that. Once the family moved out in the 1960s, the Louisier family moved out. That was kind of it. And it was her here on her own. There is no way that she could have managed all of this. We know that she didn't have the money for servants, cooks, or anything. So what happened is our grand salon, that ended up being her kitchen, her living room, her bedroom. She didn't really move out of that area of the chateau. And that's where the rest of it started. The creep and the decline has slowly started to creep in. We know that even in the 1950s, the gutter that we had to replace when we first came here, that was done roundabout then, and it hadn't been touched since. So we don't know how long water had been running down the inside of the chateau, because with the paneling on, you might have heard it, but you wouldn't have seen it. And if you were only living in the one room and you weren't coming out, you weren't going to see it all. So it's thanks to that family that it's kind of got to the point it has. And we know that the lady that we bought it from was actually related to the Bulon family, and it's been in her family, like I say, since the 50s. And she's got a massive affinity for the place, the lady we bought it from. She loves the place, she loved Lalacelle, and she wanted to do something like we did. It just didn't work out for her. So the chateau remained in the Bulon family. So after Madame Bulon died, we believe the early 80s, and this is where it gets a bit vague, and we've tried to speak to Madame Verdier because she is part of that family, but we don't have the full story. So in the early 1980s, we know that Madame Bulon died, and it was passed on to another family member, and they moved in here temporarily into the same sort of scenario, and just lived in the chateau itself. So that family only lived here for about 3 months, 4 months, because I think even in the early 80s, they could see the decline, they could see how much needed to be done with the place. And what they decided at the time is they were going to try and make a chambre d'hôte to make some money to try and keep the chateau alive. And although it was a valiant effort, it really didn't work out. It really didn't go well. And we've got some pictures that hopefully we can show you of what it looked like at the time. And even from the 80s and the 90s, the awnings were crumbling, the rooms were crumbling. It wasn't going to do well. And for what is a 25-room chateau, it had one bath and one toilet. So a chambre d'hôte was never going to work well. They did for some time have a restaurant, and they tried a restaurant, and that worked for about 2 years, and it did bring some income, and it meant that they were able to do some of the repairs, but they were so badly done. And this is where you see what we're having to do now and change. It's because they didn't have the money, they couldn't afford to properly fix it. So instead of doing what we're doing and taking our time and actually trying to restore it, they literally just hammered things on top of this beautiful paneling or ran things across it. As you can see, some of the electrics to the side of me right now are absolutely horrific, and that was all done sort of early 90s, late 80s, just to try and keep this place alive. So you can see there was a desperate attempt at some point for people to give love back to this place and try and keep it alive. But as we found, it's took us 4 years to get to this point now, just where it's livable. So you can imagine, if you haven't got the family, or you haven't got the friend, and you haven't got the time and money to be able to do it, they would never have got to any sort of point like this, and it was always going to keep going downhill. So in the early 2000s, we know that the chateau was gifted to who we bought it from, which was Madame Verdier. She was a member of the Bulon family. We believe it was her family that gifted it as a wedding gift. That's what she told us. It had been gifted to her. And then, in a loving move, her husband sold it. He seen money in it, and he sold the chateau. And for a staggering amount of money in the early 2000s, he sold it for a lot of money. Problems with it. He knew about the problems, sold it, and they sued him, and he ended up having to buy it back for what they paid for it, plus all the work that they'd done. And they'd done nearly €300,000 worth of work on it at the time. So he got his knuckles rapped by the judge 4 years later, he did exactly the same thing. So some of the windows we've shown you when we got here, they were already double glazed. There's a brand new boiler in the cellar that's never been used. And that's because the people that bought it have realised that there's major problems that he's not disclosed. And they've actually sued him again for the second time. And again, there's a newspaper article talking about Mr. Verdier and the fact that he'd sold the place twice under false pretenses, and the judge was not happy with him, so he made him pay all the court costs, all the fees, every single penny that the companies have spent on actually doing this place up. He's had to buy it back, and then it's sat there for nearly another 14 years before we've come along and actually seen the chateau and wanted to buy it from him. So I think at that point, he's just been completely sick of it, and he's just wanted rid. Mrs. Verdier, she was genuinely beautiful lady. She loved the chateau and its history, and she loved the fact that it's coming back to life. Mr. Verdier wasn't interested. He sold every single thing of value that in here, even to the point there wasn't a light fitting, a doorknob, a door handle, a key with the place. So he didn't care. He just wanted money. That's all his interests were. So that's where we are now. And then obviously we've come along and tried to embrace bringing the chateau back to life and finding out the history and how it ties in with what we're doing as well. So this is our little bit of history, and this is what we know about the chateau that we wanted to share with you. So many do ask about it, and from Mr. Pino reviving the chateau as he's done, he's started to bring it back to life and he has done his best. And again, I genuinely say, if it wasn't for him, I don't think we'd have even been at this point. I don't think even the next set of families would have been at this point. And that's where it's important about the dates on the chateau as well. So from the 1724, from when the main building was built, to the 1806 when René Charles Philippe de Saint Nicolas built the tower and put the stairs on the front and changed it. And our stamp as well. And our stamp's important. And I think the 2020, it marks keeping the chateau alive, because after I don't think it'd have been stood here 2022, 2023. The weather we've had, what we've seen, the work that we've had to do to bring it back to life, it's without that, it would be gone. The roof would be gone, the whole place would be gone. So it is important, and we hope you enjoy our history lessons. We enjoy them. We enjoy looking back at and learning about, and it helps us going forward as well. It's not always just looking backwards. It does genuinely help us going forward. So if you've enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you got the bell click for notifications. And we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
If you'd like to be part of our journey and help restore the chateau, then please join us on Patreon, where you'll be part of our journey, receive a piece of the history, and get exclusive videos.